bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, or whatever the case may be. My name is Marcus, and I am the host of the Black Brazil Today YouTube channel, as well as the blackbraziltoday.com blog, where I analyze Brazil from the perspective of race. So today, actually tonight, we're going to be analyzing some stats that came out. I don't remember when I translated this piece, but it's this article, it delves again into like widening the range of topics that I want to cover on this blog, because when I first set out to establish a blog that discussed race in Brazil, from just in the English language, again, it was mostly focused on racial issues. But over time, there have been people who have suggested that I diversify the topics that I talk about. And for years I avoided that because I just felt like with so many topics that I was already talking about on the blog, I didn't feel like I could expand it anymore. I mean, in the 11-year period that I was running the Black Brazil Today blog, again, it started off as Black Women of Brazil. I covered just numerous topics. Mostly race-oriented topics. I talked about, Black women's movements. I talked about the invisibility of both Black men and Black Brazilian women, the invisibility in Brazil's media. I've talked about what seems to be an ongoing genocide of the Black Brazilian population. Uh, the murder rates, both just murders caused by police actions or just everyday street violence, of which non-white Brazilians are usually the victims. What else have I talked about? Genocide. So let's say genocide. Also, I've talked about this idea of whitening of the population through continuous generations of mixing darker skinned people with whiter or lighter skinned people, with the end goal being a whiter population. I mean, it's documented. It's nothing that people like to dismiss as just conspiratorial. It's like, no, we have documented evidence that Brazil's government was actually trying to whiten the population by opening its doors to millions of European immigrants between, say, about 1870 and 1940. I've talked about a little bit about sports. I've talked about, I never focused just specifically on sports, but just how sports view through the lens of race, how that played out in Brazil. Um, I've talked about Black models, the experience of Black Brazilian women in the modeling industry. I've talked about Afro-Brazilian fashion designers. I mean, the topics go on and on. And so I've said this several times on the blog, where when I was talking a lot about this ongoing, just seeming to be a state sanctioned genocide of particularly Black males in the country, I would always say is often I would hear about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 20, 35 Black people get killed in a police action. And this was just like, you hear this all the time. And I would always say, I could focus my blog on just that topic alone, because the number of stories that were coming out, I mean, I couldn't even focus on everything that was going on in the country, because I could just focus on like 4 major cities, like Sao Paulo, Rio, Salvador, and maybe, I don't know, Recife, where just this massacre was just going on all the time. It was just like, how do you explain this? It was to the point where I didn't want to keep covering how many Black bodies were just being found on the ground, stretched out after catching bullets, whether on purpose or accidental. Because it was just like, if I focus on this every day, I don't think people will want to pay attention to it, because it just becomes so depressing. Every time you turn around, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, mostly male Black bodies are found, after some police action. So again, of all the topics that I've already talked about, I figured I said I didn't want to really expand too much more because I didn't want to lose focus on what I was talking about. But I've had to change my view on that because there's so many things that go on in the society that influence the race topic, and the race topic ends up influencing the society. So there are things that I could focus on that affect Brazilians as a whole, or Brazilian women, or Brazilian men. And so this topic that I'm going to talk about today, it affects all Brazilian women, and by extension the entire society. In an upcoming article, I'm going to do a little bit more just on the Black side of this topic, which I'm talking about how many women in Brazil today identify themselves as feminists. So the title of the article is "More than half of Brazilian women consider themselves feminists." This is according to a survey. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this because this is again another fascinating topic, because with the ongoing discussion online that I'm hearing, uh, particularly Black men in the United States, and this fascination with Brazilian women, and I'm just like, I don't think there's a number of us who have traveled to Brazil for a number of years. Like, I started traveling to Brazil in the year 2000. So I have 22 years of either living there, visiting there, just being associated with people there. So there's a lot of things I've come to learn in that, more than 2 decades. And so as this ongoing discussion goes on about the idea of dating Brazilian women, I just wanted to explore a little bit more uh, what Brazilian women are about, because it just seems to me online like, okay, I'm gonna just get on a plane and go down to Brazil and just I have a much better chance of hooking up with a Brazilian woman than I would in the United States, or with an American woman. And I'm not saying that's not necessarily so, but I do believe that a lot of people who have this vision in their minds don't necessarily know everything. I'm not even saying that I'll know everything. I'm just saying after 22 years, I think I have a pretty broad vision of just Brazilians in general, women and men, family structures and these type of things. And I just think it's something that's very necessary. But for both sides, this whole movement that I've heard about called the passport bros, you got African American men and women throwing sticks and stones at each other verbally. You know, Black American men have discovered not only Brazil but other countries that they look at as possibilities to finding maybe that perfect woman that they're looking for. Brazil is one of those countries, whether it be Brazil or Dominican Republic. Some are going over to Asia. Some people are going to the Philippines. So, I did a response video like sometime, I think it was last week or the week before that. And my whole point was, I think that African Americans in general could benefit from knowing just some basic things about not only just Brazilian women, but the history of Black folks in Brazil, what the experiences of Black men in the country. Because I just feel like sometimes there's a lot of stereotypes. There are a lot of assumptions. People often say things that they have never studied, they've never researched. They come to a view based on a stereotype of what they think of people in a particular country without having, put any time to research it. I hear this thing about a lot of just American women in general, or African American women specifically, speaking on how you want to just go to Brazil and take advantage of these women who aren't going to put up a fuss, or they're going to be just totally doormats for you. And I'm like, that's not the conclusion that I would come to. With the conversations that I've had over the years, with the movements that I've seen of women. Um, just this article alone should tell you that, well, this is not exactly what you think a typical Brazilian woman is like. All right. Ideals, ideologies, and movements, they're global these days. So you can't think that just something that happens in the United States will just remain isolated, because the big money is in globalizing ideologies, right? So you can't just believe that something that happens in the United States is just bound to the U.S., because the U.S. being a global dominant society, the people who control the United States, they invest in putting their money in other countries around the world. It's like, this is not just about the United States. This is something that's going on globally. And you will get to understand this when you start learning more about what's going on with the whole feminist movement in Brazil. Uh, a lot of people come to this conclusion. This is quite frankly just something that I've seen over 22 years too, of visiting and living in the country. It's like, if something gets big in the United States, eventually, whether it's weeks, whether it's days, whether it's weeks, whether it's months, whether it's years, eventually it's gonna trickle down to Brazil. I remember so many things over the 9 year period that I lived in Brazil. So many things came out in the United States, and when they appeared in Brazil, I wasn't sure. I'm like, is this something that Brazilians created, or is this something that has been picked up from the United States? I was in Brazil when the WhatsApp app came out. I was there when, what was it, the Uber started taking off. I had never heard of these things, so I wasn't sure if it was just a Brazilian thing. And then I would have to research, oh, like this is something else that comes out of the United States or whatever. Or if it didn't originate in the United States, it got popular because of what's going on in the United States. And this happens over and over. I was reading an article a couple of weeks ago, and it was just like, the Brazilian left always just copy stuff that comes out of the United States. And I have to say, I've seen a lot of that over the years. So anyway, without wasting too much more time, I wanted to get into this piece today. More than half of Brazilian women consider themselves feminists, right? So let's get into this. Just talk a little bit about this. This is a photo of women participating at the fourth Black Women's March in Copacabana, Rio de Janeiro. The first, I remember the first organizing that was going on for the first Black Women's March. I forget what year that was. It was a little bit before President Dilma was basically removed from office, and like some people call it a coup d'état. Other people say she was just impeached. But the first Black women's movement, I remember a group of Black women were meeting with Dilma after that march. So I don't know, it must have been about 2014 or 15, I think maybe 2015, if I'm not mistaken. And there's been several more after that. So you see the Black women's movement growing. It's with the growth of the internet and so many more Brazilians over the last 2 decades having access to the internet, these movements and this activism has just grown over these last few decades. So anyway, today's topic has been one that has intrigued me for a number of years. In fact, when I first started posting material on this blog back in 2011, I decided to name the blog Black Women of Brazil. Over the course of the first 5 years, I had a number of people contact me, tell me they liked the blog, but also they inquired as to why I gave the blog this name. Faced with this common question, I would always give the same basic response. As I had been following the question of race for a number of years in Brazil, I noted that much of the movement for Black rights and the push for organizing around the theme of race was being led by Afro-Brazilian women. There were all sorts of blogs and Black women's organizations that seemed to have taken the lead in the demands of Brazil's Black population. Black women and men were pushing for the acceptance of a specifically Black identity in a country that had indoctrinated most of its African descendants to reject any terminology associated with Blackness. Black women were out front calling for the acceptance of cabelo crespo, meaning kinky curly hair, which would lead to tens of thousands of Black and brown Brazilian women throwing away the infamous chapinha, the hair flattening iron. They would cut their hair, getting rid of harmful chemicals, and start rocking their natural kinks, curls, and waves. It was a fascinating transition to see. It would be a few years until Afro-Brazilian men, would start pushing back against Brazilian standards that told men of African descent that if their hair was kinky or curly, they needed to shave it as close to the scalp as possible to avoid any ridicule. I remember the famous picture of Ronaldo, Nazario. He was the leader of the 2002 World Cup, Brazilian World Cup champion. As Brazil just got recently, eliminated from this current World Cup. They haven't won a World Cup in 20 years, but I just remember the talk of the time was the haircut that Ronaldo was rocking. It was like, man, what happened? I think he had a barbershop accident or something. And, he had most of his hair, really cut short. And then he has a little patch of hair on the front. Never forget that. It was just something that a lot of people were making fun of at the time online. Anyway, Soon, Black women were organizing the first Black Women's March in the country. As a spectator, it was amazing to see how quickly the attitudes changed in Brazil's Black community. In my view, the popularity of social networks helped Black Brazil organize in about a decade what could arguably have taken 20 to 30 years without social media. With Black women leading the way, it came as no surprise that a growing number of Afro-Brazilian women came to identify themselves as feminists. Knowing that their demands were slightly different from the overall Brazilian women's movement, which was led by mostly white women, Black women carved out their set of goals and agendas. Looking at the situation from somewhat close, it struck me that Black Brazilian women's demands and leadership seemed to coincide with the growth of feminism in Brazil as a whole. Okay, this is another photo from the March of Black Women Against Racism, Violence, and for well-being. Actually, I'm not good living. I'll just say well-being. This happened in the nation's capital of Brasilia. It brought together women from all states and regions of the country.